Setting up JavaScript. Now that we have our carousel looking good, it's time to think about how the whole thing should work. In this lesson, we'll set out what we want our carousel to do and build the skeleton that will become our JavaScript backend for the carousel. To get started, open the Module 4 code file and look for folder 03 Start. A completed version of this lesson's code is in the folder 03 End. What we want to build is a JavaScript engine that changes the state of the carousel, both automatically, but also when people click on the quotes or pips. While the code we write to do this might seem complicated, what it's really doing is just switching around the classes on the HTML, and the CSS transitions can tell the browser how to animate between these states. Let's start by listing out some goals for what we want this to do. We want the carousel to move the current quote along automatically. It should show next previous quote when selected. It should stop the automatic movement at this point. Also allow selecting any pip to go to that quote. And it should animate quotes in from off to the left and right of the screen. We can add in some extra requirements, such as having the automatic mode come back on after a certain amount of time, or pausing the carousel when the browser tab is not in use. We'll look into these later, but for now, let's set out the structure of what we need for these main requirements. When building something like this, I often chip away building functions as needed and putting them together based on what I want to achieve. Sometimes it can help to start with a skeleton structure of functions and fill in the actual code later. Depending on your way of working, you may find this useful. For this example, we'll start by setting up the state of the carousel, along with the bunch of functions that we might need. In the file carousel.js, you'll find a function block at the top. Any code inside here will run when jQuery is ready. We'll set up the initial state of the carousel. By state, I mean which of the carousel items is the current one, which is previous, and next. The previous and next quotes won't always be one less or more than the current, as the carousel will need to loop, so sometimes the next carousel item might actually be item number 0, or the previous item might be the last in the line. To track these, we'll refer to them by their index value. That is their number in the list starting from 0. These values will need to be used throughout the functions we write. In this case, they'll be scoped within this function block. Any functions we add inside this block will be able to make use of these variables. We start with the previous index, which is 0, the first item in the list. The current index is then 1, and the next is 2. Lastly, let's also add a variable for the last item in the carousel. This will be useful later when we want to work out if we need to loop back to the beginning of the carousel. So that's the initial state. Next, we add in some click actions. Since we're using jQuery, we'll be able to let people click or tap and then change the state of our carousel when this happens. We'd like people to be able to click on the previous and next quotes, as well as click on the pips at the bottom to navigate the quotes. We can attach listeners to do this. Using the jQuery $, we pass in the selector, which in this case is the ID of the quotes carousel. We then chain, using a period, the on function. We tell it that the event will be click, and the class we want to listen for, and lastly the name of the function to run. For the previous and next items, we'll use a function called showQuote. Lastly, for the pips, we'll listen to that container by ID and call the function showFromPip. Next, we'll want to generate the pips. By default, we'll leave the pips container empty and let JavaScript generate them for us. It'll be easier than trying to make sure we have a matching number of pips for the carousel content. For now, we'll just run the function, and we'll actually write it in the next lesson. We write generate pips. The next step is to tell the carousel to begin. We've set up the state, and we're listening for clicks. And in theory, we've generated our pips, so let's set up the code that starts it running. We begin with a variable that says whether the carousel is running. This will be true initially, but we want to be able to set this to false later when people click on the carousel so that it pauses the automatic movement. We then set up another variable containing an interval. Using the setInterval function, we'll then set the carousel to run every 4 seconds, but only if carousel running is true. The function we'll call every 4 seconds is called showNextQuote. We'll need to set that up and write how that works in the next lesson. Before we start coding the logic for how this works, let's finish by setting out the functions we'll need. Starting with the most recent one, we'll add the showNextQuote and showQuote functions. The first will be used when the carousel is moving automatically. The second will be used when we want to show one specific quote, either by clicking or tapping. These two functions will be primarily concerned with calculating the index of the quote we want to be the current one. We can keep our code clean by then making a helper function that updates the state based on this index value. When the state updates, we then want to update the visual carousel. Let's add a function for that. This covers the carousel part. So next, we can think about the pips. First, we want to generate them. We can do that by creating a function that we'll call earlier. With the pips generated, we need to tell the pips which one is the previous, current, and next item. Since we have the state set up, we can make use of that to set previous, current, and next classes on the pips. We'll call this function updatePips. Next, we'll add a function to catch the click event on a pip. We used it earlier in the click listeners, the function being showFromPip. Lastly, we have a bit of an edge case to think about. When the previous carousel item animates away, it's currently going to fly over to the right, where the default hidden quotes live. This would look odd, so to get around it, we'll set the left class on the previous item when it's removed. To prepare for this, we'll set up a function to take care of this eventuality. And there we go. Remember that in order to work, all these functions need to be inside the jQuery ready block, as that's where we've declared our state variables. If these functions were set up outside those curly braces, there would be no way they'd be able to access the carousel's state. Instead, it's all wrapped up nicely in this block. In this lesson, we took a fairly big leap into the JavaScript development of the carousel. While it won't work yet, we've set up the structure that we can next fill in by building the logic for each of these functions. Next up, we'll go through each of these functions and build our carousel. By the end of the next lesson, we should have a working carousel.